As if 2020 hasn't been full on enough, over the weekend we learned that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, feminist icon and Justice of the Supreme Court, had died. And with the election about 30 days away or 40 days away in the US, stakes have never been higher. And it feels like it's impacting the whole world, what's going on over there.
You say you expect the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg to go down as the most impactful individual political event of the 2020 election cycle, which is saying something given this election cycle.
Which is why I found it very perfect that 2 days after the notorious RBG died, I sat down with one of America's best novelists who's made a living rewriting the lives of Hillary Clinton and Laura Bush. I feel like we should dedicate this interview to the memory of RBG.
Oh, I know. I know. It's heartbreaking.
I feel like you, as a novelist, are scripting 2020. Are you?
I wish because I know what I would make happen next.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Freedman, and you're listening to No Filter, a weekly interview podcast with people who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. Curtis Sittenfeld is the author of 6 books, including Prep and Eligible. But most recently, she's become very well known for her fictional retellings of the lives of First Ladies. Laura Bush's life in American Wife and Hillary Clinton's in Rodham, a book where she imagines what life would have been like if Hillary hadn't married Bill. Which is why I so wanted to talk to her about what's going on in America right now. From RBG.
She very late in life, after so much sort of hard work, became this huge feminist icon of the sort that little girls dress as her for Halloween, and adult women have tattoos of her and also dress like her for Halloween. She's just such a sort of part of the fabric of American culture, and just was this very smart, very hardworking, very composed, very persistent woman, and was tiny. So I think people like this sort of juxtaposition of her mightiness and her tininess.
To Hillary.
When Hillary fans and Hillary detractors look at Hillary, they see something completely different.
Here's my conversation with the delightful Curtis Sittenfeld. Curtis, where were you on election night 2016?
I was in tears. I was in a terrible place that I have not emerged from. I was in St. Louis, Missouri. So I now live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, kind of the northern cold part of the United States. It's sort of not New York, not California.
Is it Trump country or not?
Well, so that's an interesting question. So, even some people who live in the U.S. think it is. What makes Trump country? It's really an urban-rural divide. The more rural the area, the more likely people are to have voted, and the older people are, the more likely. But actually, I live in a very blue city or liberal city, and that's almost all cities are. Some aren't, but the great majority. So sometimes you could look at a state, and in the more sparsely populated areas, everyone voted Republican, but actually more people voted Democratic, but they just live all clustered together.
How did the night unfold for you? Did you go into that night with different expectations, or were you worried?
Actually, I'll tell you one thing, and then I will answer your question. A friend of mine relatively recently, maybe a month ago, gave me a magazine. I think it was a sort of special issue magazine printed by Newsweek. And clearly they had printed them, I think, probably for Trump, definitely for Hillary. And it's this celebration of our first woman president. And it's mind-bending to read it because it's she has finally shattered the last strongest glass. You do feel like you've gone into a parallel universe in this haunting way. So I was in St. Louis, Missouri. I had lived there at that point for 9 years. And I also have kids. I'm an hour behind the East Coast, the New York time zone. I think that I felt okay, around 8:00 my time, it'll be called in Hillary's favor and we can sort of, feel excited. And then I think I kind of cycled through a few emotions of thinking, oh my God, it's possible that she won't win. And then thinking she's going to win, but this is a nail biter. And then just thinking, oh my God, like just feeling like sick. And I think a lot of people have, I mean, I don't know if it's an overstatement or not to say like
PTSD.
PTSD from like a lot of Americans from that night, like just feel totally,
Us too, in
and even
Australia.
like the New York Times had that, I'm trying, what's it called?
Like a
it's
needle
like this,
or whatever it was. I can't remember.
yeah, like showing what percentage likelihood it was. And it went from being, like 90% likely that Hillary would win to like 90% that, and like, I think sometimes people just still see those needles and think
twitching.
like, oh my God, like I can't even look. Yeah. So at some point it looked really bad. I went to bed, and in the middle of the night, I think like my husband checked and said like Donald Trump won it. I mean, it was, yeah, shocking.
What was your relationship to Hillary kind of before that moment? Like, were you part of Pantsuit Nation, the Facebook group? I was. What was your view of her?
So I had not literally been a member of Pantsuit Nation, which I think was active on Facebook. And I'm not, I mean, I'm sort of in a self-promotional writerly sense active on Facebook, but I'm not, I don't know. But I feel like in my heart, I was a member of spiritually, spiritual, but not religious. Okay. So Bill Clinton was elected when I was 17 years old, and I was a senior in high school, my last year in high school. And I was very excited. I thought both Clintons seemed wonderful, and I liked their relationship. Like I liked that the president, the new Democratic president, had this smart, outspoken wife.
Was that the first time that a president had a sort of I want to say an equal as a wife in terms of career, and, she wasn't a homemaker?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that it's hard for me to like, I don't think that my knowledge of first ladies is comprehensive, like in terms of the history of it. But I would say it was also this sort of deliberate presentation where they would say, you get two for the price of one. I think they dialed back later. But anyway, so I really liked both of them. Then during the 8 years that they lived in the White House, I came to feel like somewhat disillusioned, and like a lot of scandals had attached themselves to both of them. And so, I had sort of mixed feelings. And then when I wrote American Wife, which is this fictional retelling of the life of Laura Bush, and that came out in 2008. So, Hillary leaves the White House, becomes a senator in the year 2000. And as research for American Wife, I read her then recent autobiography, Living History. And again, I was reading it only because she had lived in the White House recently, and I thought it could give me insights into Laura Bush. And when I read that, it actually was a little bit like of a revelation, where I thought to myself, these like kind of unfavorable views that I have of Hillary, where do they come from? Like, do they come from Hillary, or do they come from like rumors that vaguely swirl around her? I mean, I feel this in my relationships with like family members or friends. If someone like really tells you lots of negative things about someone else over a sustained period of time, it's hard to ignore that completely. Like maybe you can ignore it partially, but you can't ignore it completely. And so I kind of felt like I was being sexist, or like I was holding her accountable for her husband's behavior or whatever. And so at that point, I think that I sort of realized she's a trailblazer. Like my original opinion of her was correct. And so in 2008, when she and Obama both ran, I really admire Barack Obama, and I actually really admire Michelle Obama, although I don't like the whole time when people are like, she should run. And I'm like, if she doesn't want to run, she doesn't need to. But I voted in the primary for Hillary in 2008. I was thrilled when Obama won, but like I kind of felt like, well, because he's younger, she should go first and he should go second, or maybe he can be her vice president or something. And then certainly in 2016, it felt like it's time. This is so exciting. And I guess one other tidbit with regard to having written Rodham is that because of my other novel, American Wife, an editor at Esquire magazine reached out to me in early 2016 and said, would you like to write a short story from the perspective of Hillary Clinton as she accepts the Democratic nomination for president? And I ended up doing that. And that came out, 4 months before the election or something. So I don't know. I mean, it's not, I don't think I would have written Rodham if she had won, weirdly, but I certainly have admired her for a long time.
The way that people spoke about Hillary, people who didn't like her, what was behind that? The venom, the hatred. Was it because she was a woman? The word polarizing is such an overused one and it's never used about men. But what sort of insight have you got into what she triggered in people?
So I do think often people think they're having a conversation about Hillary, and they're actually having a conversation about their feelings about like feminism and power and ambition. And she's sort of symbolic to them. I mean, I think she has some critics who are informed about her record, but I don't think that's the majority. I think that most of her critics just get a vague feeling that they don't like, or they know like 4 things about her, and 2 of them are like what hairstyle she had at certain times.
And her
then,
emails.
Like, yeah. But even like her emails, like what, if somebody said, I don't like her because of her emails, in many cases, I would love to say, okay, you have to say in complete sentences, like her emails, what? Like, what did they do, or what law did they break, or what did she do that other politicians hadn't done? Yeah. Again, I've read some very detailed descriptions of her emails, and I have no kind of concerns about them.
And you're right. People would then just pivot to things like saying, she's a liar, she's a liar. And people who are not usually engaged, and again, it was just clearly not about her. That's why I was interested in what you say about they were talking about a woman who wanted power. Is that what brought out this absolute antipathy?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Because, I mean, again, something that has been interesting is that to some extent, some of the feedback I've gotten, I mean, of course, I've gotten all sorts of feedback for Rodham, but some of it has echoed the criticism of her. So slight spoiler alert, my version of her runs for public office. And some people will say she never explains why she wants to run for president. It's like,
That's
well,
so weird.
sorry, total spoiler alert. But I'm like, she actually, there's like multiple pages where she does, and she even talks about people, wanting her to justify that. But it's almost like I always forget this quote, but I think about it a lot. It's like the whole thing about like, when a dog can dance or stand up or something, people like, there's just something like people think that, I mean, and hopefully this is becoming normalized now when women run for president, because there was this spike in the number of candidates in this election cycle. But it just seemed like people could not get past the sheer novelty of a woman running for president. And, she was so familiar as kind of like a fixture of pop culture and political culture. But as it turned out, when Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris were running, it's funny because it was almost like, well, I didn't like Hillary because of this, and then I don't like these women because of this. It's like there's always some reason. Like, yeah.
And, it's so interesting. I just loved your book because it helped me understand why Hillary stayed with Bill in real life after he cheated, when he's so clearly a serial cheater throughout their marriage. There've been all those rumors swirling around. Maybe she's a lesbian and it's just a marriage of convenience. She just wants the power, all of these things. But I thought that you explained in the early part of their relationship in your book, which was sort of based on truth, how they met at college and he really pursued her. And he was of a very different, how would you explain it? In some ways, he was punching above his weight intellectually, being with her, and she was punching above her weight in terms of hotness, being with him back then. Is that fair to say?
I think that's probably a very succinct explanation. I mean, it's funny because both of those assessments are subjective, but it's true. I mean, so I don't know. Did you see the Hulu documentary that she executive produced? So it came out last spring. I actually think based on this conversation, I think that you would find it very interesting. So there's someone who went to law school with both of them, is interviewed and says, this is a couple who really loves each other, and it would have been so much easier if they didn't. I mean, I totally believe that they're drawn to each other in many ways. I mean, like intellectually, physically, and emotionally, and that they're sort of the whole package to each other. But I should say that I've never met either of them. Like I've heard them speak, and it's not like I'm a political journalist sort of and have heard these whispers in the hallway and turn them into a novel. This is all totally from a distance. Like I certainly did a lot of research, but like I feel like my novel is sort of floating possible theories, and it's not like a biography that's like, I conclusively declare that such and such. But yeah, I mean, one other thing is that something I find sort of laughable and sexist is that sometimes people will say, well, she never would have been able to run for president if she weren't a senator. She never would have been a senator if she wasn't first lady. Like that she sort of professionally has ridden his coattails. And I think that people who knew them in law school and around that time generally considered her more impressive, and that she kind of let her career take a backseat to his, or at least in terms of he became the public face in their marriage professionally.
He was very problematic, as it is said now. And a lot of people have said that he got a pass on the accusations of sexual assault and sexual harassment and the affairs and Monica Lewinsky, you know, sleeping with an intern and then lying about it because of the good things that he did for women. Do you think that now it's just become, in this cancel culture and polarised world that we live in, it's almost impossible for people now to accept that two contradictory things can be true about a person?
Maybe, actually. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I like fiction, is that it does acknowledge that or allow for that. Yeah. I mean, it's even interesting to hear you say, like, for you to say, oh, he's problematic, which I don't think anyone would dispute that. But it's almost like, is there anyone in your life who you know who's problematic and you're close to them or feel fondness for them? Like there's almost this idea that a person being problematic should allow us to like cut them out of our life and not look back. And that's not really, it's not true in non-famous relationships. And I don't think it's true, you know, kind of like politically either.
It became very problematic for her after Me Too happened, didn't it? She came to Australia, you know, around the time of Me Too and after she'd lost the election. And there was this massive, massive stadium filled with about 10,000 women. And I was there too. And it was such an elephant in the room that she couldn't be asked about Me Too because of Bill. Is that something that you noticed?
So it's interesting. There's a New York Times journalist named Amy Chozick who wrote a book that I was influenced by called Chasing Hillary, which is about, you know, yeah, it's excellent. And she's making a TV show, I think, based partially on that. But
for those who haven't read it, she was on the campaign trail.
Yeah, in 2016. Actually, so Amy Chozick covered Hillary off and on for like 10 years, including in the 2016. And she gives very juicy, colorful details about, you know, the campaign trail and has lots of insights. And she talks very explicitly about how in the 2016 election, essentially Hillary couldn't directly address Trump's incredibly uncomfortable, unsavory record with women, because then Trump would just flip it around, which he did. You know, he brought several of Bill Clinton's accusers from the past to one of the debates. So I feel that Hillary is often held more accountable for Bill's choices than Bill is. And I think certainly that's been true in the past. I think it's maybe slightly less true now, but also neither of them is running for public office at this point.
Hillary's role since 2016 in public life has been a bit fraught, hasn't it? How's it played out from your perspective as you've been working on the book?
So it's funny because I almost feel as if when Hillary fans and Hillary detractors look at Hillary, they see something completely different. Instead of like seeing the same thing or the same person and having differing opinions, it's almost like, you know, if chocolate tasted like chocolate to me, but it tasted like tree bark to you, you know, so it's not, I think to a lot of women, like I think not only women, but certainly more women than men, and probably more women who are like 40 and above. Although again, there are young women who like her a lot too. Like RBG, I think she's like a feminist icon, a trailblazer. I think people feel, a lot of like pain and sadness looking at her and sort of feel like she talks in her book, What Happened, about women of her generation, sometimes in a restaurant or something, dragging their adult daughters over and saying like, apologize to Hillary for not voting in the 2016 election, which in some ways I feel like that is the part where if I were Hillary, I'd think like, let me eat my sandwich, like leave me alone, But I think that people feel this sort of, some women, who are progressive feel like, I admire you. I'm so sorry that like I failed you. We collectively failed you. Also, I think that for a lot of women, it felt like such a dramatic, vivid display of sexism. And I think that for a lot of women, it kind of churned up like their own experience, professional experiences. So there's that. And then there's sort of this other group. And, she has critics on the left and on the right, but people are still chanting, lock her up at Trump events, which is, well, anyway, we'll move on. But I think that there, even among some Democrats, some of them will kind of say she needs to move on, almost like she's irrelevant. And I think like, wait, let's say she writes a book. She's written a few books, including, like for kids. If she writes a book and you don't want to read it, you're well within your rights. But like, who are you to tell her not to write it? Like, she's entitled to like work professionally. She's entitled to kind of motivate her fan base, which is actually huge. I mean, she did win the popular vote. So it's weird because, she's been in the public eye my entire adult life. For so much of it, she's been a symbol. And now she's sort of still a symbol, like a slightly, this
diminished. It's true.
Yeah. Which I feel like, again, are we allowed to swear on this podcast?
Please.
At some point, I think while I was working on the book, it became public that she had a memoir coming out, and there was some like fake cover that was sent around that it was going to be called, her memoir was going to be called Fuck All Y'all, which like, I felt like that's how I would feel if I were her. Like, I know that there are people who think like she didn't do a good enough job. And it's like, oh my God, there are criticisms of her that you can make. There are criticisms of anyone you can make. She's a really hard worker. And even like, I feel like she made very deliberate, careful efforts to like reach out to all different demographics and was often mocked for doing so, like reaching out to younger voters and like sort of being mocked, like nice try, hipster granny, or like, reaching out to African-American voters. And again, being like, you're such a fraud, and so there's so much sort of whatever she does, she was sort of damned if she did and damned if she didn't. And I feel like she was a strong and hardworking candidate.
How did you feel about Joe Biden being chosen as the Democratic candidate?
I have very complicated feelings. So I think that like he would be a tremendous improvement over Trump. And so it's like, there's no question that I very strongly want him to win. I'm glad that he chose Kamala Harris as his vice president. I think that he's personally endearing in many ways. As a side note, so I did an event with him where I interviewed him on stage about the memoir that he wrote about his son's death. And during that time, I have to say, he's a delightful schmoozer. I almost felt like he was working 10 times harder than he needed to get me to like him. And I was sort of like, it's not that hard to, win over, by a Democratic politician who was vice president.
So do you think he's going to win?
Oh my God. I mean, I certainly hope so. And I think that no Democrat takes anything for granted. Hi, I'm Curtis Sittenfeld. You're listening to No Filter.
In your newest book, Help Yourself Short Stories, which I gobbled up, was just delicious.
It doesn't take that long to. It's kind of a snack. It's like a bag of chips.
Yeah, it is. It's a bag of smart chips. In the first one, which is called White Woman Lol, you tackle the subject of cancel culture. Sort of a white suburban woman says something in a restaurant that's filmed and put all over the internet and used to sort of shame her, and she gets embroiled in this scandal. What's your feeling about cancel culture and what it means? I mean, as we're talking, people are taking J.K. Rowling's new novel off the shelves in bookstores because of comments that she's made about trans people in the past. How are you feeling about cancel culture and where we're at?
I would say I certainly am thinking about it, and I'm on Twitter, and it's interesting because in some ways I feel like I remember people having this conversation like in English classes when I was in high school and college more than 20 years ago, where it's sort of like, if Ezra Pound was anti-Semitic, do we still read his poetry? Or if T.S. Eliot was anti-Semitic or something like that. I don't know. I mean, again, I feel like that's like kind of evasive or a cop-out on my part, but I think I write fiction often from a point of like questioning or confusion. And so I feel like, what do I think about this? And I'm kind of exploring it through characters. And so it's hard for me to have like some sweeping, coherent take on cancel culture. It's actually kind of hard for me to have a sweeping, coherent take on like a lot of non-fictional issues. Like it's almost like if you said to me something really like subjective, like, is this politician endearing? I would be able to say like yes or no, or like, would this person make an interesting novel? I could easily say
You're
yes
right.
or no.
It's a pretty big question. What do you think of cancel culture? What did you want to say with this short story? I should have said that. What compelled you to write it about cancel culture?
I feel like if you said to me, what's that story about? I would say a liberal white woman is filmed doing something racist that doesn't feel racist to her in the moment. And the video, goes viral. And so that's what I would say the story. Like, I wouldn't have said, I mean, I don't think you're wrong, but I wouldn't have said it's a story about cancel culture. Unfortunately, I think that white women are considered to have given like this sort of decisive victory to Donald Trump. And it tends to be, I think his supporters are less educated white women. I think that's accurate. I think that his white male supporters, tend to be more educated than his white female ones. And so I think that I and many other white women are sort of having this, even though I certainly didn't vote for him, are having this sort of like reckoning or like looking at our own culpability or, like especially I think it's a moment when a lot of white people are thinking more than we historically have about like the systemic aspects of racism. And I feel like a lot of that sort of introspection or analysis or self-analysis is very uncomfortable. And there are reasons it's uncomfortable. And I think I wanted to explore, like a few people said to me, there could not be a cringier story, which I don't think that's not a very good advertisement for it. But.
I just wanted to finish up by asking how you were doing in lockdown. Are you in lockdown? What's life like in your world?
I feel like I was like, it's like a sandwich of my being like, I shouldn't complain. Then I'll complain for 10 minutes and then I'll be like, but I shouldn't complain.
That is exactly what we're all doing. And it's like, there's no one I know who doesn't put the disclaimer and then the shit and then the other side of the sandwich just to cover ourselves off. Because we all feel so, you're right. But there's that expression, just because things can be worse doesn't mean they couldn't also be better.
Yeah, that could be a quarantine novel title.
Curtis, thank you so much. I'm so glad you wrote the book. Fingers crossed for November. We are many of us, I shouldn't speak for everybody, but we are unhealthily invested in American politics. It feels like there's a lot at stake.
It does feel like there's a lot at stake. Yeah. Thank you for being invested. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Thank you. This has been a thrill. And thank you for being invested in the outcome of our election.
Thanks for listening to this episode of No Filter. I hope you enjoyed listening to Curtis. Sometimes I pinch myself on this show that I get to interview people that I love so much. And I just sometimes want to start every interview by going, I love you. Lee Sales would never do that. That's the difference between us, one of many. You can find any of Curtis's novels by searching her name at Booktopia or going to one of my favourite lady startup bookstores. It's called Secret Book Stuff. They are two lady startups from Newcastle. And Curtis's latest set of short stories is called Help Yourself. If you're wondering where to start with Curtis books, I haven't read American Wife yet. I'm just about to because I've loved everything else that she's written so much. But, I loved Rodham. I just thought Rodham was fantastic. But her short stories, and I'm not usually a short story person, her short stories are fantastic. She always says that she loves the intensity of writing a short story because you don't have to necessarily stay with the characters for years and there's not like light and shade. You can just go really hard for a short amount of time. And if you want to know more about the glorious Ruth Bader Ginsburg, check out the episode of our daily news show, The Quickie, which we'll link to in the show notes. It's called Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Why What Happens Next Really Matters. Just search The Quickie in your podcast app. This episode was produced by Leah Porges. The executive producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Freedman, and I'll see you on mamamia.com.au.